They left her to die under the scorching desert sun, stripped of her dignity, hanging from an old oak like a warning. But fate sent a lone cowboy riding through the wasteland, and the moment he cut her down, neither of their lives would ever be the same. Under the fading gold of a Montana evening, Clara Bennett stood at the edge of the Bennett Ranch, her boots half buried in the dust that once felt like home. The breeze carried the scent of hay and wood smoke, mingled with the faint creak of the weathered barn door. She kept her eyes on the horizon, but her thoughts were fixed on the man approaching from town. Victor Hale, his silhouette sharp against the setting sun. Clara, he called, voice smooth as worn leather, yet edged with something she couldn't name. She smiled faintly. "You're late. I thought maybe you'd change my mind." His smirk was a slash of arrogance. "No, darling. I told you I'd be here." She'd once loved that smirk, believed it meant he was sure of them. Now it felt like a blade pressed against her ribs. Victor closed the distance boots, crunching over gravel. "We need to talk," he said, eyes restless, darting toward the barn. Toward the house, never quite meeting hers. She studied him in the cooling light, noting the shadows under his eyes. "You've been gambling again," she said softly. His jaw tightened. "I've been making investments. That's what you call it now." He stepped closer, lowering his voice, as though the dry grass could carry their words to someone else. "I'm in deep, Clara. These men, they don't take late payments. They've given me one way out." Her heart sank before he spoke the words. "They want you." Silence fell heavy between them. The crickets in the field seemed to stop. Clara stared at him, unable to breathe. Victor leaned in the shadow of his hat, covering her face. "You're beautiful. You're perfect for what they want. Just for a while. Once my debts are clear, I'll get you out." She stepped back as if his breath had burned her. "You'd sell me like cattle." His smile was cold eyes narrowing. "Better you than me. You've always been too proud, Clara. Maybe this'll teach you where you stand." Her voice trembled but didn't break. "I stand here, Victor, on the land my father broke his back to keep, and I will not leave it to become your coin." Something in his gaze shifted resentment, maybe fear of the men who owned his debt. "Then you've made your choice," he said flatly, "and I'll make mine." He turned on his heel, walking back toward town, without looking over his shoulder. She watched him go, the long shadow of the man she once trusted, stretching across the dirt road like a warning. That night, the knock came. Not Victor's, but the hard, impatient pounding of strangers. 3 men stood in the doorway, their faces half hidden by the brims of their hats. One of them tipped his head toward her. "You're coming with us." Her stomach knotted. "I'm not going anywhere." The tallest stepped forward, his hand heavy on her arm. "You'll walk, or you'll be carried. Makes no difference to us." The wind outside was sharp, smelling of dry sage and dust. They dragged her toward a waiting wagon, the boards worn and splintered. Her boots scraped the ground as she twisted, fighting the iron grip on her arms. "Let me go," she cried, voice tearing in the open air. No one answered. They rode hard into the desert night stars, burning cold above. The men spoke in low voices. She couldn't catch their laughter, bitter. When the wagon stopped, they pulled her down, her breath catching at the sight of a lone oak tree standing against the emptiness. One of them yanked the ribbon from her hair, letting it fall to the dirt. Another tore at her shawl. She clutched what she could to herself, her mind screaming prayers she couldn't form aloud. When they were done, they left her with nothing but the dust and the wind. Rope bit into her wrists as they tied her high, the bark rough against her skin. "Victor sends his regards," the tallest said, before mounting up. She hung there, the cold seeping in as the moon climbed higher. Her lips cracked throat raw, but she would not give them her tears. By the time the first light bled across the horizon, her strength was gone. The desert seemed ready to claim her. A faint sound reached her ears, the rhythmic thud of hooves. Through the shimmer of heat, a lone rider emerged. He was tall in the saddle, his hat pulled low, a dark coat flaring behind him as the wind shifted. He slowed when he saw her, his horse tossing its head. "Hold on," he called, voice deep and certain. She didn't answer, couldn't. But her eyes found his, and something passed between them, a recognition as if they both knew this moment would change everything. The rider swung down his boots, hitting the sand with a soft thud. He cut the rope in one swift motion, catching her before she fell. His coat wrapped around her like night itself, warm against the chill of dawn. "You're safe now," he murmured, though they both knew safety was still far away. Her head rested against his shoulder as he lifted her onto his horse. The smell of leather and dust filled her lungs, grounding her in the fragile truth that she was still alive. Behind them, the oak tree stood silent, a witness to betrayal. Ahead, the open land stretched toward something unknown, perhaps justice, perhaps redemption. She closed her eyes as the horse began to move, the steady rhythm of its stride, like a heartbeat she could borrow for a while. And somewhere deep inside, past the ache and the rawness, a small ember of resolve began to glow. The wind coming off the plains that evening was sharp enough to cut through bone, but Clara felt nothing. She stood in the parlor of Victor Hale's home, the velvet curtains drawn against the dying light, her hands balled in the folds of her skirt. He sat slouched in a leather chair, the cut glass tumbler in his hand, trembling not from drink, but from the kind of fear a man feels when the noose is already tightening around his neck. "You'll come with me to El Paso," he said, his voice flat, eyes refusing to meet hers. "There's a house there. They'll pay well for a girl like you." Clara's breath caught. For a moment she thought she'd misheard him, that the wind outside had carried some madness through the window. "You're asking me to—" "I'm telling you." He interrupted the words, clipped and cold. "I owe more than I can repay. If I don't hand them something worth keeping, they'll hand me back in pieces." He looked at her then, and there was no love in that gaze, only calculation. She stared at the man she had once believed would lay down his life for her. Now he was measuring hers against his own survival. "Victor, you'd sell me." Her voice was barely a whisper. "I'd save myself," he replied with a bitter half-smile. "Don't act so righteous, Clara. Out here the strong live. The rest get swallowed." The silence between them swelled thick and airless. She could hear the mantel clock ticking, feel the grain of the wooden floor under her boots. She thought of her mother's kitchen back home, the smell of fresh bread, the way her father's hands used to rest on her shoulders when he prayed. That world felt a lifetime away, unreachable. "I'd rather starve in the dust than live like that," she said finally. Her voice did not rise, but it carried something harder than iron. Victor's jaw tightened. "You won't have a choice." He stood moving to the desk, where a stack of letters lay bound with twine. She noticed the envelope on top bore the red wax seal of the Kettering brothers' men, known for leaving debtors swinging from cottonwood trees. "They've given me a week," he said, slipping the letter back into place, "but I intend to pay tonight." Her skin prickled. She stepped back toward the door, her instincts telling her to run, but two shadows filled the frame before she could move farther. The men were strangers to her, thick-shouldered, their faces hard from years of cruelty. One removed his hat, not out of respect, but to scratch at the scar running down his temple. "This, her?" he asked. Victor nodded once. The taller of the two stepped forward, and Clara's stomach turned. She could not recall later the exact moment when the lamp was knocked over, or how her shawl slipped from her shoulders to the floor. The room became a blur of rough hands, muffled laughter, and the pounding of her own heart. She fought until her strength was gone, and then the night swallowed her whole. When awareness returned, the air was colder, thinner. The stars above seemed cruel in their distance. She was suspended by the wrists from a low branch of a lone oak out in the desert, her feet barely brushing the hardpan earth. The men's voices were fading, carried away on the wind. One of them called back over his shoulder, "By dawn, the coyotes'll take what's left." They did not look back. Clara hung there, her body aching, her mind drifting in and out of darkness. She thought of the creek behind her childhood home, how the water had been cold enough to numb the skin, but never cruel. She thought of her father's voice reciting psalms when the storms came. And somewhere deep inside, beneath the bruises and the sting of betrayal, a stubborn ember still burned. "You will not break me," she murmured into the wind, her lips barely moving. Hours passed. The moon climbed high, silvering the jagged stones around her. Coyotes yipped in the distance, their cries echoing through the emptiness. Her arms screamed with pain, her throat dry as dust. She prayed not for rescue, but for the will to last until morning. It was the steady clop of hooves that pulled her from the edge of sleep. At first she thought it was a dream, some echo from another life. But then a figure emerged from the darkness, a man on horseback, his outline sharp against the pale horizon. He pulled up short, staring at the sight before him. For a long moment, neither moved. Then he swung down from the saddle and crossed the sand with purposeful steps. His hands were gentle but quick as he cut the rope. She collapsed into his arms, the scent of leather and dust filling her lungs. "You're safe now," he said quietly. His voice was low, steady, like a promise forged in the very earth. Her eyes fluttered open, meeting his for the briefest moment. In that look, she saw no calculation, no cruelty, only the kind of steadiness a drowning soul could cling to. And as the wind swept over the barren land, carrying away the last echoes of her captor's laughter, Clara felt something she thought she'd lost forever. A fragile thread of connection stretched between two strangers under the endless western sky. It was enough to keep her breathing. For now. The night had no moon, only a restless wind moving through the mesquite, whispering like a warning. Clara stood on the back porch of Victor's house, her arms wrapped tight around herself. The boards beneath her bare feet were warm still from the day's sun, but her skin felt cold. Inside, the low murmur of male voices rose and fell, laughter sharp as glass. She knew that sound. She had once thought it charming. Now it felt like the opening notes of a storm she couldn't outrun. Victor stepped into the doorway, his silhouette backlit by lamplight. He looked at her the way a banker looks at land, assessing its worth, not its soul. "You're going to fix this for me," he said, voice smooth the way a knife is smooth before it cuts. Clara's jaw tightened. "I'm not a thing you can sell, Victor. I'm not your way out." He came closer, the scent of whiskey clinging to him like another layer of clothing. "You think you've got choices? I've got men breathing down my neck who'll break every bone I've got if I can't pay. But you could fetch more than enough to wipe me clean." Her hands balled into fists at her sides. "My dignity isn't yours to bargain with." He smiled, then cold, the kind that leaves you feeling more alone than silence ever could. "You've always been stubborn. Let's see how stubborn you are when you've got no one left to protect you." The voices inside grew louder. Boots scraped against the wooden floor. Clara's heart pounded, but she forced herself to stand tall. "I'd rather die in the dust than live that way." Victor's eyes narrowed, and for a moment she thought she saw something almost human flicker there, fear maybe. But it hardened, and he turned toward the dark figures gathering behind him. "Teach her what it means to refuse a gift," he said. His tone was casual, but it sliced through her like a blade. Hands grabbed her arms before she could move. The porch spun in her vision as they dragged her across the yard toward the open desert. She caught the smell of dry sage, the grit of sand grinding between her teeth, when she cried out. Above the stars burned cold, and far away too far to hear. They took her to an old oak, its twisted limbs clawing at the night. Her breath came in short, sharp bursts. She tried to hold her head high, but the weight of their laughter pressed down harder than the rope they tied around her wrists. There was no moon to see her shame, but she felt it in the way the wind shifted, carrying her ragged breathing into the emptiness. By the time they stepped back, leaving her bound to the gnarled trunk, her body shook, not from the cold, but from the hollow ache of betrayal. One of them leaned close enough that she could feel the heat of his breath. "Victor says no one will find you out here," he murmured. "And if they do, they won't want what's left." She kept her eyes fixed on the horizon, refusing to give him the satisfaction of her tears. When they rode off, the pounding of hooves faded into the vast, indifferent dark. For a long time, Clara listened to the wind. It whispered of coyotes and dust storms of things that swallowed the unprepared whole. Somewhere deep inside, a voice told her she was already gone. But another voice, faint, almost drowned, said, "Not yet." She thought of her mother's hands kneading bread on a Sunday morning, of her father's calloused palm closing around hers when she was small. "We're more than what the world tries to make of us," he'd once said. She clung to that, now wrapping it around her, like the shawl she no longer had. The night stretched on hour after hour. Her muscles cramped. Her throat was raw from thirst. But the stars wheeled above her, marking the slow march toward dawn. Somewhere beyond the dark, she thought she heard the steady rhythm of hooves. At first, she dismissed it as memory, a trick of exhaustion. But it grew louder, more certain, until a shape emerged from the shadowed edge of the desert. A lone rider approached his hat, pulled low, his outline blurred by the shimmer of starlight. He reined in beside the oak, dismounted without a word. In the dim light, Clara saw his eyes steady, assessing, not the eyes of a man come to finish what others started. He drew a knife from his belt. The blade flashed briefly before he reached up and cut the rope. Her arms fell limp, and she staggered, caught by hands that were rough but careful. "You're safe now," he said, his voice deep and quiet, as if speaking too loud might shatter the fragile thread holding her together. Clara wanted to answer, but no words came, only the weight of the night pressing against them both. He shrugged off his coat, wrapping it around her shoulders. "We'll get you out of here. Just lean on me." As he lifted her onto his horse, Clara felt the faintest stir of something she'd thought was gone, trust, or maybe the seed of it. The wind that had mocked her now seemed to carry her forward, away from the oak, away from the voices, toward the faint promise of morning. Behind them, the tree stood alone in the desert, its branches lifting toward the stars. She knew she'd see it again one day, not as the place where she was broken, but as the place where she began to piece herself back together. The desert was bleeding into dusk, the sky a long ribbon of copper and lavender stretching over miles of dust and stone. Elias McGraw rode slow, his mare's hooves pressing deep into the sand, the sound muffled like a heartbeat under a heavy blanket. He had been riding since dawn, no destination in mind, just the quiet, the wind, and the comfort of not needing to explain himself to anyone. Up ahead, a dark silhouette swayed against the horizon. At first, he thought it was just the carcass of a buzzard-snared branch, the kind you'd see from time to time out here. But as he drew closer, something in his chest shifted. It was no branch. It was a woman. Her head hung to one side, hair tangled and matted with wind-blown grit. A rope bit into her wrists, her feet barely brushing the sand. The wind pulled at the torn edges of her dress, revealing more of her skin than the desert sun had any mercy for. Elias felt his jaw tighten. He swung down before the mare had fully stopped. "Ma'am." His voice was low, rough from disuse. No answer, just the faintest movement of her chest. Alive. With his pocket knife, he sawed through the rope. Her body fell into his arms light as if the desert had already taken half of her away. She gasped when his coat wrapped around her, a sound so small it nearly broke him. "It's all right," he murmured as if speaking to a wild thing that might bolt. "You're safe now." Her eyes opened just enough to meet his eyes, ringed in exhaustion, but deep enough to drown in. "No," she whispered. Her voice cracked raw. "No one is safe here." By the time they reached his cabin, night had swallowed the desert whole. He carried her inside, laying her on the bed that had been his alone for years. A kettle sang softly on the stove, and he poured water into a chipped mug, bringing it to her lips. "Slow," he said, holding it steady. "You've been too long without." She drank, but her hands trembled. "Why would you stop?" she asked as if the question was heavier than her body. Elias leaned back on the chair. "Because I've seen too many things left to die out there." He studied her, the bruises blooming like ink stains on her skin. "And I can't stand the smell of cowardice, least of all my own." She flinched when the fire popped. He noticed but didn't press. Instead, he brought over a basin and a clean cloth, dipping it in warm water and wiping the dirt from her face. She kept her eyes shut, but when he reached her wrists, she pulled back. "Who did this?" His voice was steady, but the air between them tightened. Her lips pressed thin. "Someone I once trusted with my whole heart," she said. "He owed men more than he could pay, and when I wouldn't sell myself to cover his debt, he decided my ruin would be quicker than my refusal." Elias's hands stilled. "That's not a man. That's a snake in boots." She looked at him, then a faint fire stirring in her gaze. "He's worse. And snakes don't run a town." The next day she moved slowly, as if testing her own bones. He watched from the porch while mending a bridle, not speaking, until she stepped outside his coat, still around her shoulders. "You planning to head back?" he asked. Her eyes searched the horizon. "Back where there's nothing waiting for me there, except whispers and doors closing." He set the bridle aside. "Then maybe you stay. At least until you figure where you're going next." A long silence hung between them, filled only by the wind curling through the mesquite. She sat on the step, pulling the coat tighter. "I thought when he left me there." "I thought that was the end," she said softly. "I thought there was nothing left to find but the sky above and the sand below." "But you?" She stopped shaking her head. "Why, you don't know me." Elias looked out over the land, his voice low. "Ma'am, I don't need to know your whole story to see you didn't deserve what was done. Sometimes that's all a man needs to know." She studied him a long moment, then asked, "And what do you deserve?" He met her eyes, something unreadable flickering there. "I'm still working that out." That night, while she slept, he sat at the table staring at the lamp's small flame. Her words echoed in his mind, the betrayal, the cruelty she'd endured. He had seen his share of meanness in men, but this felt different. This wasn't about winning or losing. This was about taking back something they thought they could erase from her. From outside, coyotes called to one another. Elias thought of the rope, the tree, the wind tugging at her limp form. He thought of the man who left her there. He leaned back in his chair, a decision settling in his bones, like the weight of a well-worn revolver. In the pale hours before dawn, she woke to the sound of coffee being poured. Elias stood by the stove, the smell rich in the air. "You'll need your strength," he said without looking at her. For what she asked. He finally turned his eyes steady. "For whatever you decide comes next. But you should know if you want justice, I'll ride beside you." Her fingers tightened around the mug he handed her. For the first time since he'd cut her down, her shoulders lifted with something that wasn't fear. "Justice," she repeated. "Not revenge." He shrugged. "Sometimes they wear the same coat, but I reckon you'll know the difference when the time comes." Outside, the horizon was just beginning to blush with light, the shape of his horse dark against the awakening sky. And for the first time in days, she felt the faintest warmth in her chest, a fragile thread of belief that maybe, just maybe, she hadn't been left alone in this world after all. Elias had seen the desert take lives before men who had gambled too far into its heat cattle, driven past their strength, even friends who'd wandered too long without water. But this was different. Clara lay on the narrow cot in his cabin, her skin hot and damp lips cracked the shallow rise and fall of her chest, barely keeping time with his own breath. Outside, the wind pushed against the warped boards, sifting grains of sand through the cracks. Inside, he could hear the faint, irregular sound of her trying to breathe. He dipped the rag into the basin, squeezed it out until the water dripped slow, and wiped her forehead. Her eyes flickered open just long enough to catch his, then closed again. "You're safe here," he murmured, though he knew the words were too small to carry the weight she bore. She whispered something so faint he had to lean close to catch it. "Safe is just a word, isn't it?" The words rooted in him. He didn't answer right away, just wrung out the rag again and thought about all the times safe had been promised to him and come to nothing. That night, the fever took hold harder. She tossed muttering fragments, names he didn't know, curses spat in a trembling voice, pleas that made his jaw tighten. Once she gasped out, Don't take me back there." He sat by her through the hours, the lantern casting a dim pool of gold around them. Outside, coyotes called, and the night felt long enough to stretch into another life. When dawn came pale and dusty, she woke for a moment more lucid. She turned her head toward him. "Why?" she asked. "Why what? Why would you bother with me? I'm nothing but trouble for a man like you." He leaned back, letting the chair creak. "I've had my fill of leaving folks to die. Figured I'd try something different." Her eyes held his a little longer this time, searching before she drifted again. Later, while he was brewing coffee, she startled awake, clutching the blanket to her chin. "Victor." She said the name sharp as a thorn. He said I was selfish. Said if I cared about him, I'd do what needed doing. That's what love was to him, just paying his debts with someone else's life. Elias set the pot down slowly. And when I told him I'd rather die, he smiled. That kind of smile you don't forget. Then the others came. She didn't go on, and he didn't make her. Some truths didn't need the whole telling to be understood. "You know," he said, after a while, "a man's debts are his own. Anyone who says different is already halfway a coward." Her lips trembled, but no tears came. "I hate him for what he did. But I hate myself more, for believing him once." "That's the thing about trust," he said, pouring her a small tin cup of water. "It's only worth something when it's in the right hands. You handed yours to a thief, that's all. Doesn't make you less." For the next 2 days, he kept her fed on broth and watered with sips small enough not to make her sick. She began to sit up, leaning on the wall, watching him work, mending tack-splitting kindling, moving with the steady rhythm of someone who knew the value of quiet. One afternoon, as he was patching a saddle strap, she spoke. "You don't talk much. Talking's never fixed a busted fence or put food on the table. Maybe not, but sometimes it keeps a person from falling apart." He glanced up at her, saw the challenge in her gaze. So he told her about the year the cholera came through, how he'd buried his own kin without a preacher to speak over them, how after that he'd kept to the saddle, going from job to job, never staying long enough to lose again. You think leaving keeps you safe, she said softly. It's worked so far. But safe, she murmured, echoing her words from before, is just a word. That night the fever broke. She slept deep and still, and when she woke her eyes were clearer. She ate without him having to coax her. When the light faded, they sat outside the desert cooling under a wide starlit sky. You ever think about going back? She asked. Back where? Wherever it is you ran from. He considered it. Every day. And every day I tell myself there's nothing there worth the ride. She nodded. I used to think that about my past, too. But now, I think maybe I have to go back. Not to stay. Just to make sure it can't hurt me anymore. He studied her the way her jaw had set the new steadiness in her posture. That kind of thing takes more than one set of hands. She looked at him, then really looked as though weighing whether he was offering what she thought he was. You don't owe me anything, Elias. Maybe not. But I don't like the idea of Victor walking around thinking he can do what he did and sleep easy. A breeze came through carrying the smell of creosote and dust. For a while neither spoke. Finally she said, I used to pray for someone to come save me. Now I think maybe I just needed someone to stand next to me while I saved myself. He gave a small nod. Then maybe we're both in the right place. Inside, before she settled for the night, she paused in the doorway. Elias, yeah. If I fall apart on the way, promise me you won't just leave me where I land. He met her gaze. You've got my word. For the first time since he'd cut her down from that tree, she smiled, a small tired curve of the lips, but real. And as the desert night closed around the cabin, it seemed to Elias that maybe, just maybe safe, could mean something again. The lantern on Elias's kitchen table flickered low, casting amber light over Clara's face. She sat there with her hands curled around a chipped mug, the steam from the tea rising like a thin veil between them. Outside, the wind rattled the loose boards, a restless whisper against the old cabin walls. She hadn't spoken for a long while, just traced the rim of the cup with her thumb. Elias waited. He had the patience of a man who knew some wounds bled invisible. Finally, she said almost to herself, It's strange the way memories don't die. They just wait, in the shadows, until you're too tired to fight them off. Her voice was raw, the kind that made a man set down whatever he was holding. Elias leaned back, the chair creaking. You don't have to. I do. She cut in, her eyes flashing up to meet his. If I don't let it out now, it'll bury me whole. She told him about Victor, not the public charm, not the smile that fooled the whole town, but the quiet cruelty, the way he looked at her when he thought she was his to command. She spoke of the night he came to her door with his voice sweet as molasses and his words dripping poison. You could make this right for me, he'd said, standing too close, the smell of whiskey hanging off him. One night in the right place and my debts disappear. You'd be helping me, Clara. You'd be saving us both. When she refused, his face hardened like a frost. You always thought you were better than the rest of us. Well, let's see how high and mighty you feel when no one in this town will look at you without spitting. Her hands trembled around the mug. Elias didn't move, though every muscle in his body wanted to. He let her finish. They dragged me out where the wind never stops. Took what they could, left what they couldn't stomach. And the worst part wasn't the pain. Her voice faltered, and she stared into the dark corner of the room as if she could see it all again. It was knowing they'd walk back into town and be greeted like respectable men. Elias's jaw flexed. Men like that don't stay respectable for long. She gave a humorless laugh. They will if I stay quiet. He reached across the table, resting his calloused hand over hers. For a moment, she didn't move. Then she let her fingers slip into the space between his. "You don't owe me your past," he said, his voice low. "But if you want your truth heard, I'll walk beside you." Her gaze softened, the first trace of something other than anger glinting in her eyes. "And when they turn on you, I've had worse men try," he replied, and there was something in the way he said it, a weary defiance that made her believe him. The fire in the hearth popped, sending up a quick shower of sparks. She leaned back, letting the warmth seep into her bones. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying with it the faint smell of rain. It was a smell she remembered from her childhood, the kind that made her mother pull quilts from the cedar chest and hum old hymns by lamplight. "I keep thinking of my father," she murmured. "He taught me that a person's worth is in what they stand for, not what they endure. I'm not sure I ever understood that until now." Elias studied her for a long moment. "Then maybe it's time you stood." There was no speech, no grand vow, just the weight of two people deciding in the stillness of that small cabin that the past had had its turn. The night wrapped around them, but the air between felt lighter. Later, when the rain began to patter against the roof, Clara lay awake listening. The memories hadn't gone, she knew they wouldn't vanish overnight, but they no longer crouched in the corners of her mind, waiting to ambush her. They were out in the open now, under the gaze of a man who didn't flinch when she spoke their names. Somewhere in the darkness, she heard Elias moving about, checking the latch on the door, the sound of his boots soft against the worn floorboards. It was the quiet work of someone who knew that safety wasn't promised, but could be made piece by piece. Clara closed her eyes, breathing in the scent of rain-soaked earth drifting through the open window. For the first time in years, she let herself imagine a day when the past would be nothing more than a shadow she could walk ahead of. And in that imagining, she wasn't walking alone. The wind had a way of carrying the past out here. Clara felt it every time it swept across the porch, rattling the loose tin on Elias's roof, whispering through the cottonwoods like an old ghost that refused to rest. She sat on the edge of the chair he'd fixed for her, her fingers knotting the hem of her dress. She had been quiet for days, watching breathing, healing in fits and starts, but now there was something in her stillness that made Elias uneasy. It wasn't the quiet of someone resting. It was the quiet of someone counting the cost. "I can't let it go," she said finally, her voice low but steady. "I tried to tell myself I could, but every time I close my eyes, I see their faces, and I hear his voice." Elias kept his gaze on the coffee in his hands. "I know." "You don't," she said, and her eyes found him then dark sharp, cutting through the dust between them. "You've buried your ghosts. I'm still standing in the graveyard with mine." He set the mug down the wood, groaning under its weight. "Revenge won't bring back what you lost, Clara." Her lips trembled into something that was not quite a smile. No, but it might keep them from taking anything from anyone else. There was a long pause. Outside, a crow called once, twice, then the air went still. When she spoke again, her words carried the weight of every mile she had walked in this desert, every bruise the sun had kissed into her skin. "I want him to look me in the eye when the truth comes out. I want him to feel the ground give way under his feet, the way it did under mine that night." Elias leaned back, studying her. "And if you fall with him, then at least I'll fall standing." They spent the afternoon without speaking, much the way people do when words would only spill the wrong kind of truth. Elias mended tack out back. Clara sat by the window, tracing the lines of the horizon. Each of them carried their own silence. By nightfall, she was in the barn, her hands running over his old saddle, like she was learning it by heart. Elias found her there, lamplight cutting their shadows against the wall. "I'm not asking you to fight for me," she said, not looking up. I'm asking you to stand beside me while I fight for myself." There was a long breath between them. Then he took the lantern from her hands, set it on a beam, and said, "If we're going to do this, we do it right. We don't just go after him. We go after every rotten root he's got in this town." Her eyes softened just a fraction. "You mean it?" He nodded once. "But you have to promise me, when this is over, you walk away from the ashes. You don't stay to breathe them in." The next days were a study in shadows. They moved like water through the edges of town, listening more than speaking. Elias talked to the blacksmith under the pretense of shoeing his horse. Clara found the widow who kept the boarding house and traded pie for information. At night, they laid the pieces out on the kitchen table: names, dates, debts, unpaid, whispered confessions from folks who'd been too scared to speak before. Each scrap of truth felt like a stone in Clara's pocket, heavy but grounding. One evening, as they sifted through the latest rumor, Elias glanced at her. "What will you say when you face him?" She didn't hesitate. "You could have asked me for anything, and I would have given it, except myself." The firelight caught the edge of his jaw as he looked away. "He'll deny everything." "Let him," she said. "The truth doesn't need his permission to be real." The night before they made their move, Clara couldn't sleep. She walked outside the desert cold, pressing against her like a second skin. The moon hung low, washing the land in silver. Elias joined her quietly, a blanket slung over one shoulder. "It's not too late to walk away," he said. She smiled faintly. "Do you know the first thing I remember after you cut me down?" He shook his head. "You didn't ask me who did it. You just covered me like I was worth the trouble. That's why I can't walk away. You gave me back enough of myself to fight for the rest." He didn't answer, but he pulled the blanket around her, his hand resting briefly over hers, before he stepped back. By dawn, the plan was in motion. Elias would draw Victor out with a business offer too tempting for his greed to ignore. Clara would be there not as a victim, but as the one holding the proof of his betrayal. Before they parted, Elias caught her gaze. "No matter what happens in there, you keep your head high. You don't let him see the girl he left in the desert. You let him see the woman who walked out of it." She nodded, her voice steady. "And you don't let me fall." "I won't." Later, when Clara stood in that crowded room, the walls close with the breath of a dozen onlookers, she saw Victor's face change just slightly when he realized she was alive. He tried to sneer, to spit venom. "You think anyone will believe you over me?" Clara held his gaze, her voice like steel under velvet. "I don't need them to believe me. I just need them to see you." And for the first time since that night under the old oak, she felt the ground steady beneath her feet. Elias was there just beyond the edge of the crowd, his eyes locked on hers. She didn't smile, but she didn't look away. Whatever came next, they would face it side by side. And somewhere deep in the marrow of her bones, the wind began to carry something new, not the whispers of the past, but the quiet promise of a reckoning. The wind off the prairie carried a bite that evening, a restless whisper threading through the cottonwoods behind the saloon. Clara stood in the shadow of a livery stable, her shawl pulled tight, eyes fixed on the yellow lamplight spilling from the windows. Somewhere in there, laughter clinked against glasses, the kind of laughter that had once made her feel welcome. Now it sounded like a locked door. Elias stood beside her hat brim, low, one hand resting lightly on the butt of his revolver. He didn't speak yet. He knew better than to break the silence when a person was sorting through ghosts. "They think they can just drink away what they've done," she murmured, voice brittle as frost. "But guilt doesn't drown. It floats. Always comes back up." Elias's gaze swept the street empty except for a mangy dog nosing at trash. Then we'll make sure it surfaces where everyone can see it." Inside, Victor's voice rang clear above the din, smooth and smug. "Some folks are just born to serve others to own. That girl never knew her place." Clara flinched. Elias caught the twitch in her jaw, the way her hands tightened into fists. He leaned closer. "We don't go in guns blazing. We make 'em look over their shoulder every hour of the day. Fear's slower than a bullet, but it cuts deeper." The plan had been taking shape for weeks, quiet, careful, stitched together like a quilt, where every patch had its purpose. Tonight, they'd start sewing in the darker pieces. Elias stepped into the saloon alone. His shadow stretched long under the swinging doors, a slow-moving stain of night. He didn't sit. He just stood at the bar, ordered a whiskey, and let his eyes rest too long on each of Victor's companions. "You boys sleep well lately?" His voice was mild, but there was iron under it. "Funny thing. I rode past the old oak yesterday. Thought I heard the wind say a name." He didn't have to say which name. The smile drained from one man's face. Another shifted in his chair, suddenly fascinated by the floorboards. Victor laughed too loud, too forced. "Cowboy's drunk, pays too much attention to trees." Elias tipped his hat, drained his glass, and left without another word. The silence he left behind was louder than any threat. Out back, Clara waited. "What did you do?" He gave her a look, half smile, curling like smoke. "Just planted a seed." The days that followed were a slow tightening of the noose. Anonymous notes left in coat pockets, scraps of paper with dates, places, and the drawing of an oak tree. Lantern light flickering at midnight outside their windows, then vanishing before they could grab a rifle. A door left ajar in the morning that had been bolted the night before. Clara played her part with quiet precision. She delivered eggs to the general store and accidentally let slip a story of a rider seen at the old oak talking to the wind. She asked the seamstress if she'd ever noticed how guilty men tend to drink faster when a stranger walks in. One evening, she found herself standing in the churchyard, fingers tracing the weathered stone of her mother's grave. Elias joined her, saying nothing for a long time. "My mama used to tell me," Clara began, voice low, "that the Lord doesn't always use thunder to get his point across. Sometimes he sends the smallest sound, like a creak in the floor, and it's enough to keep a man from sleeping." Elias's eyes softened. "Reckon you're doing his work then?" The fear began to show. One of Victor's men left town without a word, riding hard toward the border. Another started showing up at church every Sunday, hat in hand, eyes darting toward the door. Victor tried to keep the swagger, but it frayed at the edges. He snapped at his men, drank alone more often, and once Clara saw him on the boardwalk at dusk, turning sharply as though he'd heard someone call his name. Only the street behind him was empty. One night, Elias returned from a quiet ride out past the ridge with dust on his boots and a folded paper in his vest. He set it on the table. Inside was a ledger, the ink still fresh, names, amounts, and the ugly proof of debts paid with cruelty. Clara stared at it, her breath catching. This is the nail. It's the truth, Elias said, and once it's out, it'll stick deeper than any bullet. For a long moment she just looked at him, the lamplight flickering over the lines in his face. "You've given me back something I thought I'd lost." "What's that?" "The part of me that still believes justice doesn't have to be shouted to be heard." Elias's gaze held hers steady as a steady flame. "Then we keep going. Slow. Sure. Until they feel it in their bones." And as the wind rose outside, carrying the dry rustle of the cottonwoods, Clara felt for the first time in a long while that the tide had begun to turn. Not with a roar, but with a whisper that would not be silenced. The afternoon light in Red Creek had a way of showing everything it touched, every crack in the boardwalk, every speck of dust hanging in the air, every wrinkle in a face that had learned how to wait. Clara stood in the center of that stillness, the brim of her hat shadowing her eyes. Beside her, Elias McGraw leaned against a hitching post, arms folded, gaze fixed on the far end of Main Street. The saloon doors swung open with a lazy creak, and Victor Callahan stepped out as though he owned the ground beneath his boots. He still wore the polished black vest and gold watch chain, but his eyes, they darted restless, looking for an ally he no longer had. "Never thought I'd see you back here," he drawled, the smile on his lips as brittle as a frostbitten leaf. "I figured you'd have the sense to stay gone." Clara's voice was steady, but low enough that only he and Elias could hear. "I came for the truth, and I'm not leaving without it." Victor laughed, but it wasn't a sound of joy, it was the sharp bark of a cornered animal. "Truth." His eyes narrowed. "Truth is what folks can be made to believe. You of all people should know that." Behind them, the townsfolk had begun to gather, shopkeepers wiping their hands on aprons, a ranch hand leaning on a fence rail, the blacksmith pausing mid-hammer. No one spoke. The only sound was the wind curling down the street, lifting the edge of Clara's coat. Elias took a half-step forward, his voice quiet but iron-edged. "Then let's see what they believe when they hear it from her." A flicker of unease crossed Victor's face. Clara could see it. The same man who'd once whispered promises to her by lantern light was now calculating the angles of escape. She didn't give him the chance. That night she said, her gaze never leaving his, "You sent them for me. You thought if I disappeared, your debts would vanish too. You thought the desert would keep your secret." Victor's jaw tightened. "Careful, Clara. Words like that can turn a crowd ugly." Elias's voice was a calm stone dropping into still water. "Or maybe they'll turn it honest." From the back of the crowd, an older woman stepped forward, Mrs. Avery, who'd run the boarding house since before Clara was born. Her voice trembled but did not break. "I saw you, Victor, that night. I saw them drag her past my window. I didn't speak because I was afraid." She met Clara's eyes, shame and resolve mingling there. "Not anymore." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Someone else spoke up, a wiry ranch hand who'd once worked Callahan's spread, and I heard him threatening the banker for more time. Said he had a solution in mind. Victor's eyes darted from face to face, searching for the loyalty he'd once bought with favors and intimidation. It wasn't there. "You think they'll take your word over mine?" he spat, turning back to Clara. "You—" But Clara cut him off, her voice rising just enough to carry. "I think they'll see what's been here all along. You hid behind money and fear, Victor, but neither can stand in the light." Silence followed, heavy as a held breath. Then Elias stepped back, giving her the space. Clara reached into her satchel and pulled out the ledger pages, worn thin ink, faded but still legible. She held it up so the nearest could see. "His accounts," she said. "Debts names and the payments he made. To the men who left me hanging from that oak." The blacksmith took it from her, flipping through his brow, furrowing deeper with each page. "It's all here," he said, to no one in particular, but loud enough for the crowd. "Every dollar, every lie." Victor lunged as if to snatch it back, but two ranchers blocked his way. The sheriff, silent until now, stepped forward, laying a hand on his holster. "I think it's time we had ourselves a formal talk, Callahan." Victor's laugh this time was hollow, stripped of bravado. "You all think you're better than me, but you'd have done the same to save your own skin." Clara's reply was quiet, but it carried like a bell through the street. "No, Victor. The difference is, I'd rather lose everything than lose myself." The sheriff motioned and Victor was led away, his boots scuffing the dust in uneven steps. The crowd parted to let him pass, no one meeting his eye. When it was over, the street felt different, not louder, but freer somehow, as if a weight had been lifted from the air. Mrs. Avery touched Clara's arm. "I can't undo my silence," she said, her voice breaking, "but I can stand with you now." Clara gave a small nod, not ready for forgiveness yet, but grateful for the truth finally spoken. Elias watched her, the corner of his mouth curving just slightly, not in triumph, but in quiet acknowledgement. As the sun dipped lower, painting the storefronts gold, Clara felt a shift inside her, not the erasure of pain, but the first fragile root of peace taking hold. She glanced toward the horizon, where the oak stood far beyond the town, its branches stark against the sky. One day she murmured more to herself than to Elias, "I'll walk out there and stand under it again." But not in fear. Elias's reply was almost a whisper. "When you do, you won't be alone." They stood together in the cooling air, the street slowly emptying the sound of boots, and voices fading into the hum of evening. And though the scars would remain, the truth had been given daylight, and daylight, Clara knew, was where healing began. The morning sun spilled over the rooftops of Dry Creek, painting the dust in a soft gold that felt almost cruel. The square was already crowded, farmers in faded hats, ranch wives clutching shawls tight around their shoulders, children perched on crates to see. In the center, a wooden platform had been set up, not for a hanging this time, but for a trial. Clara stood at the edge of that platform, her hands clasped in front of her. She wore a simple blue dress Elias had found for her weeks ago, but her eyes, clear and steady, were the only thing anyone saw. They held the weight of months of silence, and the echo of something no one could steal. Across from her, Victor leaned back in his chair, a faint smirk twisting his mouth. Even in shackles, he managed to look like the man who thought the world would always bend to him. When the sheriff read out the charges, kidnapping, conspiracy, abuse, he barely blinked. "You think these people care about your sob story?" he muttered loud enough for Clara to hear. "They'll forget you by next winter. But me, they'll always need men like me." Clara's jaw tightened. She didn't answer, not yet. Elias stood a few feet away, hat low, his eyes fixed on her. He had said almost nothing on the ride into town. But when he'd helped her down from the wagon this morning, he'd paused, fingers light on her elbow. "You don't have to prove anything to them. Just tell the truth." The judge, a gray-bearded man with a voice like gravel, called her to speak. The square quieted until all she could hear was the creak of the boards under her boots and the wind whispering through the cottonwoods. She looked at the crowd, and for a moment saw only her father's weathered face, how he used to sit on the porch, carving wood in the evening light. She thought of her mother's hands, always smelling faintly of bread dough and lavender. Then she thought of the night she had been taken from the world she knew and left to die under a desert sky. "My name," she began, "is Clara May Dawson. Some of you might remember me as the girl who sold eggs outside the post office before I disappeared. What happened to me wasn't an accident. It wasn't bad luck. It was a choice, made by a man who thought he owned me." Victor shifted in his chair, smirk fading. She didn't give details she didn't need to. The way her voice caught, the way her fingers twisted together, told them more than she could ever say outright. "He thought breaking me would keep me silent. But I'm still here, and I will not carry his shame for him." From somewhere in the crowd, a woman whispered, "Lord, help her," and another voice murmured, "Bless her heart." The prosecutor brought forward the letters, Victor's own handwriting deals, struck to trade Clara's life for his debt. Then came the witnesses, an old ranch hand who had seen the men ride out with her that night, a storekeeper who'd heard Victor boasting over whiskey. Each word was another stone laid on the truth's foundation. Victor laughed, once sharp and cold. "All of you sitting there pretending you're better than me, you've all looked the other way before. Don't act like saints now." That stirred the square. A murmur rose not in agreement, but in anger. Clara let the silence stretch before she answered, her voice low, almost trembling. "You're right about one thing, Victor. Folks have looked away, but not today. Today they're looking right at you." The judge's gavel came down hard, cutting through the rising noise. The verdict was read guilty on all counts. The sentence, 20 years hard labor property seized to repay debts and damages. It wasn't death, but it was a life stripped of power, the only currency Victor had ever known. As the deputies led him away, he glanced back at Clara. There was no smirk now, only a kind of hollow disbelief, as if he'd finally understood something about the limits of his reach. The crowd didn't cheer. They didn't need to. Justice in Dry Creek was a quiet thing, like rain after a long drought sinking in slow. Elias came to stand beside her. For a moment, neither spoke. The square was emptying, boots crunching over the dirt, voices fading toward the saloon and the mercantile. "You did more than just win a trial," he said at last, his voice low. "You gave them permission to see." Clara looked at him, and for the first time in months, the tightness in her chest eased. "And what about you, Elias? What do you see?" He met her eyes, tipping his hat back. A woman who walked through fire and didn't let it burn away her soul. Her lips curved, not quite a smile, but close. The cottonwoods rustled overhead, scattering sunlight across the worn boards beneath their feet. Somewhere a bell rang from the church at the edge of town. As they stepped down from the platform, an older woman reached out, pressing a small sprig of lavender into Clara's hand. "For peace," she said softly. Clara held it like something fragile, but alive, breathing in its scent. The two of them walked across the square, side by side, the noise of the town falling away behind them. Ahead, the road stretched wide and open under the summer sky. Clara glanced once over her shoulder, not at the platform, not at the jailhouse, but at the people lingering in the shade, talking in low voices, their faces turned toward her without judgment. She had been brought here in chains of another kind, but she was leaving on her own feet, with the truth laid bare. And in the quiet between their footsteps, she realized that was the first step home. Victor Garrity stood in the center of the dusty main street, flanked by two deputies. The wind carried the smell of horse sweat and dry earth, and somewhere a church bell tolled the hour. Folks had gathered, shopkeepers with aprons still dusted in flour, mothers holding children, close old men with their hats clutched tight. No one spoke. They'd all come to watch the fall of a man who had once walked among them like a king. Clara stepped out from the shadow of the mercantile. She wore a simple cotton dress, the same pale blue Elias had found in a trunk months ago. It fluttered faintly in the breeze, but she stood like a rooted tree. Her eyes locked on Victor, and for the first time since the day under that oak, she did not look away. Victor smirked, a pale imitation of the confidence he once wore. "You think parading me through town will wash you clean?" His voice was low, bitter. "These people," he tilted his head toward the crowd, "they'll forget you tomorrow. But me, I'll find my way back." Clara's voice, when it came, was steady. "There's no coming back from what you've done. Not for me, not for the others." He laughed, dry and sharp. "You think you're the first woman who turned me down, the first to think she was too good for what I offered. You made your choice, and I made mine." Elias stepped forward, then his boots grinding against the grit. "Your choice," he said quietly, "was to turn a woman's life into coin for your debts. Your choice was to leave her swinging in the sun. You gambled with her breath like it was yours to spend." His voice wasn't loud, but it carried, and the murmurs of the crowd stilled. The judge, a wiry man with spectacles perched low on his nose, cleared his throat and read the charges. Words like extortion assault, conspiracy to commit murder, rolled through the hot air. Every sentence was a nail, every pause a tightening of the rope around Victor's neck, not the literal kind, but the one woven of truth and memory. Clara watched his jaw tighten, his eyes flicker from face to face, searching for an ally. There were none. Even the men who'd once laughed at his cruel jokes now stared at the ground. "You'll rot for this," Victor spat toward Elias. "Both of you. You think this is the end, it's just the middle." Clara's fingers curled against her skirt. "No, Victor. This is the end. The middle was the night you thought I'd break." Something shifted in her voice, then something the women in the crowd recognized. The weight of silence finally set down. A widow near the front dabbed her eyes with her apron. An old ranch hand nodded slowly, as if he'd been waiting years to see this day. The sentence was read: 30 years hard labor in the territorial prison. The deputies took his arms. Victor tried one last smile, but it wavered, broke, and was gone. As they led him away, a gust of wind kicked up the dust, swallowing his figure until he was only a memory moving down the road. The crowd dispersed in quiet clusters, conversations low and lingering. Clara remained where she was, the sunlight slanting across her shoulders. Elias stood beside her, but didn't speak. There was nothing to say that would improve on the silence. Finally, she looked at him. "It's strange," she murmured. "I thought I'd feel lighter. But it's not lightness, it's stillness. Like a storm passing, and you're not sure if you can trust the calm." Elias studied her face. Maybe calm's not meant to be trusted. Maybe it's meant to be lived in one day at a time. Her gaze drifted toward the road leading out of town. "When I was tied under that oak, I thought I'd never see another dawn. Now, I don't know what to do with all these mornings." "You live them," Elias said, "and you don't let anyone steal them again." For a moment, the only sound was the soft creak of the sign over the mercantile door, swaying in the wind. Clara closed her eyes, felt the sun warm her skin, not as an enemy, but as an old friend returning. Somewhere deep inside, a knot began to loosen. She opened them again, met Elias's steady look. "I don't hate him anymore," she said almost to herself. "He's already lost more than I could take." Elias gave a slow nod. "That's not forgiveness," he said gently. "That's freedom." The two of them walked toward the edge of town, boots scuffing the dirt. The air smelled faintly of sage. Somewhere behind them, the sound of the bell rang again. 12 slow notes that seemed to measure not just the hour, but the ending of a chapter. They passed the old oak on the ridge as the sun began to lower. Its branches cast long shadows, but its leaves were full and green. Clara paused, touched the rough bark, and whispered something Elias couldn't hear. Then she turned and walked on, leaving the tree to sway in the wind, a witness to both the worst and the best of what people can be. And though the road ahead was long and unknown, they took it together step for step, carrying the kind of quiet that comes when truth has finally been spoken, and when the future, fragile as it was, belonged wholly to them. The wind through the cottonwood sounded like a river, soft and steady, as if the tree itself were breathing for the two of them. Clara sat on the old bench Elias had built from reclaimed barnwood, her fingers tracing the grain like she was reading a story written in rings and knots. The sun was low, spilling gold across the porch, and somewhere in the pasture, the wind chimes sang a tune that didn't need words. "It's strange," she said quietly, "how a place that once held your worst memory can become home." Elias leaned against the porch post, his hat tipped back so the light caught the lines in his face. He didn't rush to answer. "Home ain't where the hurt never was," he said at last. "It's where the hurt learned to rest." The cottonwood in the yard had been just a sapling when they planted it 2 years ago, on the very spot where he'd found her. Back then, she'd been all sharp edges and hollow eyes, the wind pulling at her hair like it meant to carry her away. Now she wore her strength differently, not as armor, but as something that lived under her skin, quiet and steady. Victor was gone. The trial had been ugly and public, his voice dripping venom until the last moment. "You think you've won," he'd spat at her from the wagon that took him away. "But you'll never wash it off. The whole town knows what you are." She hadn't answered then. She'd just watched the dust rise behind him, letting the silence speak for her. It had taken time to learn that truth didn't always roar. Sometimes it simply endured. Elias stepped down into the yard, checking the fence line out of habit. Clara watched him, thinking how his presence had filled in the hollow places of her life without ever trying to. He didn't need to fix her. He just stood beside her while she found the tools herself. She remembered the first autumn here, when the nights came early, and the wind rattled the windows. She'd wake sweating from dreams she couldn't name, and Elias would be in the chair by the door boots, on rifle across his knees. "Go back to sleep," he'd murmur. "Ain't nothing getting past me." Now in the second spring, the land had softened around them. Chickens clucked in the yard, a mare and her foal grazed beyond the fence, and the cottonwood's branches swayed heavy with new leaves. "Do you ever think about leaving?" Clara asked. Elias looked up at her. "Not since you came here." Then, after a pause, "And you?" She smiled faintly. "I used to think I'd run until there was no one left who knew my name. Now, I like hearing it here." The evening stretched between them, full of little sounds, the creak of wood, the far-off low of cattle, the whisper of grass. It felt like the land itself was exhaling after a long season of holding its breath. Clara reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "I've been writing letters," she said. "Not to send, just to speak to the people I used to be." "Does it help?" Elias asked. She looked at the cottonwood. "It reminds me that I've lived more than one life, and that the worst day of one doesn't have to poison the rest." The sky deepened to that in-between color, not yet night, no longer day. Elias came up the steps and sat beside her. For a while, they just listened to the wind. "You ever gonna tell me what you said to him that day?" Elias asked finally, his voice low. She knew he meant Victor. She'd never told anyone, not even in court. "I told him," she said slowly, "that he could take my past, but he couldn't keep my future. That was mine." Elias nodded like a man filing something away to keep. Down the road, the first lamp in town flickered on a small circle of light in the darkening blue. Clara thought about the women who'd stopped by over the past year, some with stories they couldn't say out loud, some just looking for a place where no one asked too many questions. They always left with a jar of preserves or a loaf of bread, and sometimes with more than that, a sense they weren't alone. "That tree," Elias said, nodding toward the cottonwood. "I figure it's gonna outlive us both." "Good," Clara replied. "Maybe someone will sit here someday and feel safe, even if they don't know why." The night came in quietly, the way healing does not all at once, but in steady steps, until you look around and realize you're not where you were. Clara leaned her head against Elias's shoulder, the smell of sun and wood smoke in his shirt. Some wounds never closed the way people expected. Some left marks you could feel even when you couldn't see them. But here under the branches they'd planted together, she understood something she hadn't. The day he found her, survival was just the beginning. "Elias," she murmured. Thank you. For not turning away." He didn't answer right away. Then, with the same quiet certainty he'd carried since the day they met, he said, "Darlin', you were the first thing worth turning toward." And under the cottonwood, the wind kept on singing.